Welcome to our discussion on the powers and functions of Congress. The primary source of congressional authority in the is the U.S. Constitution. If you look at this table, the Constitution enumerates or lists to Congress a number of different powers. The nature of these responsibilities reveals that the Constitution is both very specific in describing congressional powers, as in punishing illegal acts on the high seas, and at the same time quite vague, as in its language establishing the federal court system. Many of the specific duties of Congress reflect Americans' bitter experience in the colonial era, in that the framers granted powers to Congress that they did not want to place in the hands of a strong executive. For example, the economic powers granted to Congress, including the ability to tax and spend, to establish tariffs, and to borrow money, all limit the power of the president. Powers specifically granted to Congress still have a distinct impact on our everyday lives. For example, Congress regulates currency, establishes weights and measures, and administers post offices. As we have seen, the connection between Congress, particularly the House, and the people was crucial to the framers, and so the Constitution requires that all taxation and spending measures originate in the House because the framers believed this chamber would be nearer to the people, and that House members would therefore ensure that the people's will was done. The Constitution, moreover, imbues the Congress with an additional source of power, one that has proved very important in the expansion of legislative authority over time. As we discussed in our Constitution chapter, the necessary and proper, or elastic clause, states that Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the Constitution in the government, carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all the powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in department or office thereof. This clause has been responsible for Congress's ability to legislate in many matters not described in the enumerated powers. Reforming our nation's health care system, determining the powers of law enforcement in investigating terrorism, and regulating stem cell research are all examples of powers not enumerated in the Constitution, but that Congress exercises because of the broad scope of the authority provided by the necessary and proper clause. In addition to the Constitution, Congress derives power from Supreme Court decisions, the media, and the people. Supreme Court decisions often uphold the constitutionality of a law, in a sense, verifying Congress's ability to create policy on a given subject. The media grant Congress power by providing members with a forum in which to communicate with constituents, sway public opinion, and create a favorable climate for the passage of legislation. The people are a key source of congressional power through civic participation in the electoral and legislative processes. Citizens communicate their views and priorities to their representatives, who then can claim public support in their endeavors to enact policy. Let's examine the functions of Congress. The Constitution is far more explicit in defining the responsibilities of the national legislature than it is in describing the function of the other branches of the government. In its shaping of congressional functions, the Constitution's concerns with limited government, checks and balances, the separation of powers, and the creation of a federal system are all readily apparent. In delineating the composition of the federal legislature and the procedures for electing its members, the Constitution shapes the congressional function of representation in several ways. Representation traditionally involves a House or Senate members articulating and voting for the position that best represents the views of his or her constituents. But sometimes a member of Congress may speak for other constituencies as well. For example, a feminist legislator might represent feminists nationwide, just as a gay legislator might represent the collective interests of gays across the United States. Often, Congress's policy-making function is at odds with its representation function. A legislature may be pressured by his or her political party or own conscience to vote for a policy that clashes with constituents' interests or views. In representing constituents, legislators frequently follow one of two models of representative behavior. The first one is the trustee model. And according to the trustee model of representation, a member of the House or the Senate follow his or her own conscience when deciding issues, positions, and determining how to vote. Sometimes a legislator relying on the trustee model will act contrary to the views of his or her constituents. This model was espoused by British political theorist Edmund Burke, who served in Parliament as a representative of Bristol, England. Explaining his conception of representation, Burke emphasized to his constituents, however, that a member of Parliament is not a member of Bristol, he is a member of Parliament. Burke accordingly argued that a member of Parliament should follow his conscience when making decisions in the legislature. Your representative owes you, not his industry only, but his judgment, and he betrays, instead of serving you, if he sacrifices it to your opinion. In this trustee view, a legislator may act in opposition to the clear wishes of his or her constituents, such as in the case where an action is for their own good, or the good of the society. Another model of representation is the instructed delegate model. The idea that a legislator, as a representative of his or her constituents, should vote in keeping with the constituents' views, even if those views contradict the legislator's personal views. This model of representation conceives of legislators as the agents of their constituents. A legislator hewing to the instructed delegate model faces a dilemma when his or her constituency is evenly divided on an issue. Given these two different models of representation, which one do legislators typically follow? Most analysis of representation indicate that legislators are likely to combine the approaches. Specifically, with regard to many important or high-profile issues, legislators act as instructed delegates, whereas for more mundane matters about which their constituents are less likely to be aware or to hold a strong position, they rely on the trustee model. Members of Congress also represent their constituencies through pork barrel politics. Pork barrel, also simply called pork, refers to legislators' appropriations of funds for special projects located within their congressional district. Because pork brings money and jobs to a particular district, legislators who are seeking re-election work aggressively to secure monies for their states or districts to bring home the bacon. Members frequently use transportation bills as a means of creating pork barrel projects for their district. One analysis estimates, for example, that for every $1 billion spent on highway and mass transit projects creates about 47,500 jobs. And members of Congress are happy to take credit for the jobs and for highway and mass transit improvements when running for re-election. In 2010, Congress appropriated about $16.5 billion for pork barrel projects. Hawaii received the most per capita at $259.78, which is per person. Wyoming took home the least at $12.28, and if you look at this list, this is the top 10 pork receivers in 2010. Members of Congress also use earmarks. Earmarks as a means of representing constituent interests, a designation within a spending bill that provides for a specific expenditure. And so, for example, in 2009, Representative Lynn Woolsey of Democrat of California helped ensure that the Sonoma County Integrated Emergency Operations Center Information and Communication System was granted a $190,000 earmark in the federal budget for police and emergency communications. But many critics of the earmark process complain that earmarks are a way for members of Congress to reward supporters. Sonoma County had spent $320,000 lobbying federal lawmakers for that $190,000. Let's look a little more closely. These were earmarks that were in last year's budget. So you have $1.2 million to study the breeding habits of the woodchuck, $84,000 to find out why people fall in love, $150,000 to study the Hatfield-McCoy feud, $19 million to examine gas emissions from cow flatulence, $2 million to construct an ancient Hawaiian canoe, $1 million to preserve a sewer in Trenton, New Jersey as an historic monument, $100,000 to research soybean-based ink, $57,000 spent by the executive branch for gold-embossed playing cards on Air Force Two. Casework, as you learned in your previous Prezi, is a special form of representation. It refers to providing representation in the form of personal aid to a constituent or a group of constituents, typically by getting the government to do something the constituent wants done. Members of Congress and their staffs commonly assist constituents in dealing with bureaucratic agencies. In doing so, they serve in the capacity of an ombudsperson, an elected or appointed representative who acts as a citizen advocate by listening to their needs and investigating their complaints with respect to a particular government agency. For example, a member of Congress might intervene with the Immigration and Naturalization Service, or INS, to request that a constituent's relative in a foreign country be granted a visa to travel to the United States. According to political scientist Maurice Fiorine, casework is a valuable tool for legislators. She points out that serving constituents is relatively easy for members of Congress because bureaucrats, who depend on Congress for their funding, typically respond quickly to the requests of legislators. The loyalty derived from assisting constituents is one aspect of the incumbency advantage that makes incumbent members of Congress more likely to be elected than their challengers, who do not enjoy that source of constituent loyalty. Casework benefits constituents when, for example, a member of Congress's staff works with a local branch of a Veterans Administration clinic to secure services for a retired veteran whose family members derive a sense of efficacy, a feeling that they can get things done and that the government works for people like them. They perceive that their individual member of Congress genuinely represents them and protects their interests, with the result that these constituents not only feel engaged, but are also likely to advocate for their member's re-election bid. But casework is not without its costs, as noted by Walter F. Mondale. Mondale, who served as member of both the House and the Senate, as well as a vice president of the United States, warns that casework can take a legislator's time away from his or her legislative responsibilities. He said, "Good constituent service is, of course, necessary and honorable work for any member of Congress and his staff. Citizens must have somewhere to turn for help when they become victims of government bureaucracy. But constituent service can also be a bottomless pit. The danger is that a member of Congress will end up as little more than an ombudsman between citizens and government agencies. As important as this work is, it takes precious time away from Congress's central responsibility as both a deliberative and a law-making body." In describing the constituent service dilemma, Mondale raises questions worthy of citizens' reflection. For example, is the national interest served when a congressional staff member has to track down your grandma's Social Security check? Does doing so result in a missed opportunity for government officials to create policy with broad, significant implications? And is the use of congressional staff members as ombudspeople a prudent application of taxpayers' money? Each year, Congress passes laws determining everything from incentives for the creation of alternative energy sources to what restrictions should govern gun purchases to what law enforcers can do when they suspect someone of being a terrorist. The Constitution invests Congress with other policy-making powers as well, including the authority to tax and spend, to declare war, to establish courts, and to regulate the armed forces. This policy-making function is the central responsibility that the Congress carries out, and nearly all its other functions are related to its policy-making role. Congressional policy-making power also extends to the operations and priorities of governmental departments and agencies. For example, Congress has directed the State Department to select a domestic, secure production facility to create e-passports, next-generation passports with an embedded microchip. In creating a system of checks and balances in the Constitution, the framers established the key congressional function of oversight. Oversight is the process by which Congress checks the executive branch to ensure that the laws Congress passes are being administered in keeping with the legislator's intentions. Congressional oversight is a check on the executive branch because the federal bureaucracy that implements laws is part of the executive branch. In carrying out their oversight function, members of Congress use a variety of tools, some of which are listed here. Congressional hearings, in which governmental officials, bureaucrats, and interest groups testify as to how a law or a policy is being implemented and examine the impact of its implementation. Secondly, confirmation hearings on presidential appointees to oversee executive departments or governmental agencies. Thirdly, investigations to determine whether a law or a policy is being implemented the way Congress intended it to be, and inquiries into allegations of wrongdoing by government officials or bureaucrats. And lastly, budgetary appropriations that determine funding of an executive department or a government agency. These tools ensure that Congress has some say in how the executive branch administers the laws that Congress creates. Members of Congress increasingly have viewed their role of checking the executive branch as crucially important. Congress engages continually in agenda setting, determining which public policy issues the federal legislature should consider. Indeed, political scientists such as Cox and McCubbins assert that agenda setting relieves the pressures parties face in getting their members to vote with the party. At the beginning of a congressional term, with the party. At the beginning of a congressional term, House and Senate leaders announce their goals for the coming season. These goals reflect the issues and positions that predominated during the electoral campaign and that congressional leaders perceive to represent the people's priorities. In setting the national agenda, Congress serves as a key agent in molding the scope of civic engagement and discourse. As people learn about, discuss, and form positions about issues, frequently, agenda setting is itself influenced by public discourse, as when constituents complain to a member of Congress about a problem that needs to be solved, or when an interest group contacts a legislator about a policy its membership would like to see implemented. For example, in 2010, pressure from gay rights activists led Congress to eliminate the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy on gays in the military as part of a defense spending measure. Though elimination of the policy was narrowly defeated, its inclusion demonstrates how the public shapes the congressional agenda. Congress also has a significant influence in managing the societal conflict inherent in a divided society such as the United States. Some citizens want policies benefiting rural areas, and others give higher priority to urban areas. Some want more money for programs for senior citizens. Others seek funding for children's programs. With respect to abortion policy, some people are pro-life and others are pro-choice. In addition, there are divisions related to social class, race, geography, gender, sexual orientation, religion, and so on. Congress manages these conflicts by representing a wide range of views and interests.